If we have somebody who is suffering interminably, so they're suffering now, and there's every prospect that they will go on suffering miserably for months, years, all the way until their eventual demise, should we allow such a person to ask a doctor to help him or her die? What about somebody who has been given a terminal prognosis, somebody who is believed to be on their way out the door, so to speak, somebody who's been given a few months to live or something like that? Should we give that kind of person the ability to ask a doctor to help them die sooner than they would otherwise? These are the kinds of questions that we'll talk about in today's episode of Theopologetics. Hi, this is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Well, hello, and welcome to another episode of Theopologetics. I am, of course, Chris Date, and I'm very thankful that you are tuning in, whether that's live in the case of Susan and Buffalo Bev in the chat, or whether it's after the episode has aired, has streamed live, and then been archived in the channel. Either way, I am very thankful that you're here. For those of you who are new, just remember, I want to let you know that Theopologetics is part of what's called the Trinity Commission. The Trinity Commission is a network of podcasts and YouTube shows that are affiliated with professors of Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. People like Braxton Hunter and Jonathan Pritchett of Trinity Radio, Leighton Flowers of Soteriology 101, Steve Gregg of The Narrow Path, and others. If you would like to tune into those other shows that are part of the network and learn from a diverse faculty, but in an informal setting, like in podcasts and YouTube, then go to Facebook and search for the Trinity Commission. It's a very underdeveloped page as of yet, but in time we will build it up, and it will be a sort of one-stop shop for all the shows that are part of the Trinity Commission network of shows. So, yeah, encourage you to do that. And also, if you're looking for a higher Christian education but don't have the time or money to be able to afford a very traditional, especially brick and mortar experience, then maybe check out Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary at trinitysem.edu. That's trinitysem, S-E-M, short for seminary, trinitysem.edu to learn more. I think that Trinity is doing something really special. It's why I'm honored to be a part of it. Looking forward to get my feet dirty. Is that the word? Getting my hands dirty in teaching. Haven't done so yet, but am working on that. But it's just a real fantastic institution where you're going to get instruction from very good scholars, but also very committed Christians whose goal isn't to just fill your head with knowledge. We want to help transform you. We want to help you to become sanctified and shaped and molded more and more into the image of Christ. And so at Trinity, you're going to get not just the scholarship, the academics, but also the spiritual side of things. And you'll be taught by a diverse group of faculty, diverse not just in terms of ethnicity, but diverse in terms of viewpoints. I mentioned a number of names a few moments ago: Leighton Flowers, Braxton Hunter, Jonathan Pritchett, Steve Gregg, and others. And none of them are Calvinists, unlike me. And I'm also a physicalist, unlike all of them. And there are lots of other differences that we could list as well. But what we all share in common is a commitment to the saving gospel of Jesus Christ and to the essentials of the historic Christian faith. And so if you want to go to a school where you're going to be stretched and challenged both academically and spiritually, and where you will learn from people who hold to a diversity of secondary issues but all agree on the essentials, then Trinity is for you, and I'd encourage you to check out trinitysem.edu to learn more. One quick announcement before we dive into the topic today. I had announced a little over a month ago, I think, that I would be debating the Muslim apologist Shabir Ali on whether the New Testament teaches that Jesus is God. That was scheduled for early this month, this month being January. But a couple of days before the debate was scheduled to go to stream, I heard from the moderator of that debate that Shabir has had some family issues come up that required us to push the debate out by a month. So now the debate between me and Shabir Ali is scheduled for February 2nd, I think. And if you want to learn more details, just go to chrisdate.info. That's the website that I announced last episode of Theopologetics, where you can go to find all of upcoming events, past episodes of this show and of Rethinking Hell Live, and all sorts of other stuff that I do. It's going to be a lot easier to point people to the work I've done by telling them to go to chrisdate.info than it has been having to point them to 8, 9, or 10 other websites. So if you're looking forward to that debate, don't worry, it is still coming, but it's been pushed out. Susan, yes, I will be teaching Biblical Hebrew, but not yet. It's been a really hectic year, and I've got another hectic couple of months, but pretty soon I will be starting to teach it. Okay, so with all that sort of housekeeping stuff out of the way, let me tell you what's going to happen today. First of all, you're going to watch an interview that I conducted a few weeks ago, I think it was. So what you're about to watch has been pre-recorded. What you're watching right now, if you're watching live, is live. I've already mentioned people that are making comments in the chat, so clearly I'm live right now. But the guest that I had on to interview is in the UK, where this normal showtime would be a little bit difficult for him to connect. And so I've pre-recorded the interview that you're about to watch, and it's an interview with a gentleman by the name of Mark Pickering. I first encountered Mark Pickering on an episode of Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. He was debating a rabbi on the topic of euthanasia and assisted suicide. And I was extremely impressed by Mark Pickering's his conduct in that debate. I think that he was both, on the one hand, gentle, kind, respectful, but on the other hand, extremely forceful, compelling. He brought a lot of convincing arguments to bear. And so I reached out to him, and we struck up a bit of a relationship, and I invited him to come on Theopologetics to discuss that topic in a little bit more depth than perhaps he was able to do in that show. So that's what you're about to watch. You're going to watch me interview Mark Pickering of the Christian Medical Fellowship in the UK about euthanasia and assisted suicide. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started, and I'll come back in live at the end to close the show out. So here we go. My guest today is Mark Pickering, whom I really enjoyed seeing engage on the topic of assisted dying on the Unbelievable radio program with Justin Brierley recently, and he was gracious enough to accept my invitation to come on my show and discuss the topic further. So, Mark, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Chris, it's a pleasure. I've really enjoyed listening to you before on Unbelievable, so it was great to hear from you, and just a pleasure to come on your show and talk about this really important topic.
Oh, thanks. I appreciate that. I very often, if not all the time, enjoy asking my interview guests as part of a getting to know them process about their faith background or their testimony. Viewers know that I was an atheist up until I was about 20 or 21. My wife and I got married as atheists, and then shortly thereafter I became a Christian. Is yours a case where you came to faith, as an adult, or like mine, or were you somebody that was self-identified with Christ from a very early age? Talk us through that.
Sure. So I live in England. I was born in the north of England, a place called Hull, and my parents were both Christians, so I grew up going to church, knew all the Bible stories and that kind of thing. And there was, for me, there was never a point when I rebelled against that or particularly doubted that. But when I got to about 13, it really started to strike me, to hit home, and I realized that it wasn't making any difference to me. The things I knew in my head hadn't really got into my heart, and so I started thinking, do you know what, if this stuff is true, like I think it is, then it needs to start making a difference. So, that's not to suggest that I was saved through works or anything, but I knew all the stuff about grace and repentance and things. I just hadn't actually done it yet. And so it was around that time that it started to make sense to me, and then it's just been a gradual journey since then. So I'm always fascinated to hear the stories of people like yourself who've come to faith in later life, and I think in many ways that can be a great advantage to see it fresh. Equally though, for me it's been a very steady process from my very young childhood.
Many of the guests that I have are trained, their career, their education is in theology or philosophy or apologetics. You're a bit unique among the guests that I've had on so far in that your professional training, if I'm not mistaken, is in medicine. You're a graduated medical doctor. So can you tell us, how did you get interested in medicine, and what kinds of things have you specialized in or worked in as a medical doctor in the course of your career thus far?
Sure. So I'm a GP, general practitioner, or a family practitioner, you might say, in the US, and that's how I've done my training. So I've also specialized in that sense as a prison doctor. So I'm a prison GP. Here within the UK, the National Health Service provides the medical care in all of the prisons in our country as well. And so I gradually got into that. Once I was a trained GP and working there, I sort of found my way into prison by one way or another, and it's been really interesting as a Christian doing that, because you see a whole different side to life. It's been a great opportunity for me to contribute as a Christian to see the kind of broken lives that end up in prison, the sad stories that are there, but be able to put some compassion into there, and also to really contribute and see that people are still made in the image of God, even though things have been a little messed up over the course of their lives often. So that's been really interesting in terms of my professional background. I'm the chief executive of the Christian Medical Fellowship, which we can talk about in a few minutes, but I've been involved in that ever since I was a medical student, and I think trying to apply my faith to all of the issues for Christians in a medical or a scientific environment has meant that I've been really interested in a lot of theological, scientific areas, and I just kind of picked things up over the years. Had a real interest in apologetics in different areas, but it's all been just sort of reading as an amateur and enjoying it very much.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the Christian Medical Fellowship, or CMF. Tell us what that organization is all about.
Sure. So our strapline is uniting and equipping Christian doctors and nurses to live and speak for Jesus, and that's what we're about. So we're a membership organisation in the UK of Christian doctors, nurses, midwives, and the students of those disciplines as well. Got about 4,500 members, and we're what you call a Christian workplace ministry. So we help them to apply their faith into every aspect of their life, and so sometimes that's about ethical issues like we're talking about today. Sometimes it's about things like global health. Many of our members work overseas in resource-poor countries, or we help them to think through that sort of thing, or how to apply their faith in terms of working with more vulnerable populations in the UK, like the prisoners that I work with. It might be supporting student groups. It might be helping doctors or nurses who are in leadership in healthcare, basically wherever their faith impacts their career. There's lots of nuances about how to be a Christian in a professional environment, like sharing faith with patients. Are you allowed to do that? If so, how do you do it? What do you need to be careful about? And that sort of thing. We're part of a global network of similar organizations through what's called ICMDA, the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, and we've got sister movements in the States like CMDA, and also similarly in Canada as well.
I didn't think of this question until literally the past 10 seconds or so. You mentioned the ICMDA with that D in there, meaning dental. I'm just curious, how does the dental field uniquely, or how is it uniquely affected by issues of ethics, specifically from a Christian perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the UK there's a separate Christian dental fellowship, so I think the areas that the dental parts of ICMDA tend to deal with tend to be a little bit more restricted, because you don't have quite so many ethical issues going on in dentistry. There's all the basic things about integrity and sharing your faith with patients, and that's very much important. And also global health. Lots of Christian dentists work overseas in resource-poor countries, so there's some very obvious things. I don't particularly know so many of the really specific ethical issues about within dentistry, about the more technical aspects of it, but I think certainly faith sharing, global health, and then the more sort of supporting you as a Christian in your spiritual walk as you do that. I think it's medics, dentists, nurses, midwives. They tend to be a bit like a specific people group. They have their own ways of thinking, their own communities, and I think it's very easy often to reach them through people who can talk that language and understand their environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that in just a few minutes of creative thinking, we could probably come up with some ethical issues. So, for example, what if I'm somebody who self-identifies as a vampire and go to a dentist to have them shave my teeth down to like fangs or something? Well, what's the Christian dentist supposed to do there?
It's a great example. Yeah,
interesting stuff. Well, now you are the CEO, if I'm not mistaken, of the CMF, but that's a fairly recent development given your roughly 20-year time with the CMF. What kinds of things have you done for CMF over the years that led you to the point that you're at now?
Sure. So I started in medical school about 25 years ago, and right from my first year, I got involved as a student in our local CMF group. So they really supported me in all the issues that I was thinking about, both in terms of ethical and apologetics and my walk with Jesus as a medical student. And then as I graduated, I did some work for ICMDA, the international body that I've talked about, and then I worked for CMF supporting their student ministries or leading their student ministries, because we have about 45 medical schools in the UK and Ireland, and we have student groups in most of those. And many times that was doing talks about issues like this, ethical or apologetics kind of issues that our students face. I've been on the board with CMF. I've just been a member doing other things over the years. And then when the CEO job came vacant about 3 years ago, then it was a natural question to ask whether that was something that I might apply for. And interestingly, at the time, I didn't think my family circumstances would permit that, so I did one of those things where I said, okay, Lord, if you want me to do this, you're going to have to make it really clear to me, and here we are.
Oh, very good. Well, as I said when I introduced you a few moments ago, I reached out to you because I saw you on the Unbelievable radio program with Justin Brierley, and that's really the launching point for the conversation that we're going to have. So can you say a word or two about how that discussion on Unbelievable came about, and any thoughts you have on how your interaction with your interlocutor on that show went from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks. So I was debating with a liberal rabbi in the UK called Rabbi Jonathan Romain, and he's part of Dignity in Dying. He's the vice chair of their board of trustees here in the UK. So they are the main organisation in the UK who are campaigning for assisted dying, or we would say assisted suicide. But because he is a rabbi, I mentioned he's a liberal rabbi, so most observant Jewish people would not be supportive of assisted dying, but he very much is. And one of the things that they've done more recently is to launch a sort of religious arm of Dignity in Dying. I think it's called the Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying. And that's been fascinating for me to hear about those kind of faith arguments. And I think I mentioned there that several years ago, there used to be a version of that called Interfaith Leaders for Dignity in Dying. And I'd heard about that. I'd seen a few things. He was involved then, but I'd been looking around and saying, well, what are they doing? Are they still active? And basically, I think they'd fizzled out a bit because there are so few leaders in faith organizations, faith movements that actually support assisted dying. So I think it was a bit of a rebrand for them to widen it out for all people with any kind of faith who support that. And I think that's incredibly important for us to deal with, because so often the arguments about assisted dying, they tend to be if you're religious and you oppose assisted dying, then we can ignore you because we're not religious and you're just a bit strange. But this is a new way to say, well, actually, if you're the right kind of religious person, you should support assisted dying because that's the caring, compassionate thing to do. That's what Jesus would have done, or that's what God would have us do. So it's definitely a change in the arguments from those who are supporting assisted dying, and I just wanted to be able to discuss some of that in the open with one of their leaders. So I'd just put the idea to Justin and say, well, what about a show on this with somebody from this organisation? And it was actually just after Justin had shared an old rerun of a similar conversation some years ago, and he said, yeah, great, good time to rerun that. So we ended up with myself and Jonathan Romain on there. And obviously we'll come on to talking about some of those issues there. I think in general I think that the faith-based arguments for assisted dying are pretty superficial, and I think when you actually dig into it, generally the more seriously you engage with your faith, the less likely you are to support assisted dying. But of course we'll come on to some of the details of that as we go through.
Indeed. And I very highly encourage viewers to check out that episode of Unbelievable. I thought that your interlocutor did as best a job as he possibly could making a faith-based case for assisted dying. But as my smiling and borderline laughing might indicate, I don't think it was a very good case. So, we'll dive in here in a second. So before we start zeroing in on the arguments for and against assisted dying, I wanted to make sure that we are as precise with our language as possible so that viewers know exactly what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. So first, for viewers that aren't familiar with all the various terminology that are at play in this discussion, can you explain what palliative care and hospice care are, and if there's any relevant difference there?
Absolutely, that's really important. So palliative care is the branch of medicine and healthcare which deals with situations when you have an incurable disease, normally one that is going to kill you, so a terminal illness. So that's largely to do with cancer, but these days it goes beyond that to other things like terminal heart failure, HIV care, and other things like neurological conditions like motor neuron disease. But it's the idea that you have a condition that is progressive, it's going to get worse, it's likely to cause your death at some point. And so you stop trying to cure it or trying to get rid of it, and you shift gear and you say, well, let's look at your symptoms, let's care for you in a holistic manner, body, mind, and also spirit or psychologically as well, to care for you as a whole person, without trying to extend your life artificially or to shorten it, but just to care for you and your symptoms, to palliate those symptoms. And a hospice is the place where that tends to happen. So a hospice is usually an inpatient facility like a small hospital, but very much just focused on providing palliative care. And then most hospices or palliative care teams have broadened out. Sometimes they work in acute hospitals as well, sort of supporting the doctors and nurses and the staff there who have got patients with terminal illness in the hospital or that needs symptom care. Or they often branch out into the community as well, so that you might have, say, a nursing team or some doctors who will go and visit you in your home. You might be being cared for at home, perhaps even dying at home, but having that palliative care in that setting. So it all basically goes back to the 1960s. There didn't used to be the specialty of palliative care, but a particular Christian doctor in London called Cicely Saunders, she was caring for dying patients. She'd worked as a social worker, then trained as a nurse, and finally trained as a doctor as well. And she became thoroughly convinced that we could do much better for dying people. In those days, people really were dying, often in terrible pain. End-of-life symptom control and pain management was not very well understood. And so she said, look, we can do this better. So she started the first modern hospice. It was called St. Christopher's Hospice in London, still going today. And she formed that specialty of palliative care, and that has just gone throughout the world now. So the UK in many ways is still a world leader in providing palliative care, but you see it everywhere in pretty much every advanced health system in the world. So I think it's a great example of what can be done when you don't give up and you say, here's a group of patients that at the moment we can't do much for them, but we're not just going to give up. We're not going to take the route of despondency and just say, that's it. The way out is to help, is for us to kill you, kindly or gently. It's to say, do you know what, we need to do better here. And I think that's something that I think we need to hear again. Very often we see, here is a situation when we can't help you anymore. The route is for us to give you an assisted death. No, the route is for us to care for you better. And just like Cicely Saunders did, you can revolutionize the care that is offered if you don't give up in a situation like that.
Yeah, and in fact, it makes me wonder, I'd be curious to know what your answer, speculative as it is, would be to the question I'm about to ask, but it makes me wonder, had assisted dying, as as people that are for it want to call it, had it been an option, a live and acceptable and respectable option when Cicely Saunders came to the conclusions that you described, I wonder if she might not have even really pursued that route. I'm just curious, do you think that if assisted dying is really embraced, will that diminish whatever impetus there might be to care for dying patients in with palliative care?
Yeah, it's a great question, and very often now we see that people who are supporters of assisted dying, they'll often say, no, you can have the two together. They're not either or. We want to have assisted dying and we want to have palliative care, and in places like Australia, where there's different states there have only recently changed the law or perhaps about to change the law, politicians there have made commitments to extra funding for palliative care, and that's good, of course. But when you look back at the places who have legalized it some time ago, there's some there's some very clear research for looking at Europe across the last 15 years. Countries like the Netherlands, Holland, and Belgium that have got long histories now of having assisted suicide and euthanasia, you see that their investment in palliative care, while it has increased, it's lagged way behind the countries that don't have it. Because and it just stands to reason. If you think, we can't do anything more for you, assisted dying is the route for you, once that becomes accepted in society, then the impetus is gone for all the further research. But if you don't change the law, then you say, look, we're just going to keep going, trying to make this better and better and better. And if you invest in the research and the funding and the provision, you will do better with that. So it's, in theory, you don't have to have one or the other. You can have both. But in practice, we're talking about society with real humans in real situations, and we're not talking about some kind of utopian theory. That's one of the themes that I often come back to. The idea of assisted dying, it can sound so seductive, so simple. You get this gentle death, the time of your choosing, it's nice and peaceful, you don't have to suffer, it all sounds great. But then when you actually translate it into real human society with real human nature and sinfulness, as we would see it as Christians, things start to go wrong very quickly, and we see all of that in the places where it's been legalized.
Yeah, you made that point on The Unbelievable Show, and I totally agreed that, socialism, communism, those are examples of systems that sound really good on paper and indeed may resemble what the state of affairs in the eschaton when we're totally glorified and we no longer struggle with sin. But when you try to put that kind of system in place where sinful people, fallen people, are affected by it, things don't work out as cleanly as they do on paper. So that's a very good point.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to think of it in terms of an algorithm. I think of it as X plus sin equals whatever. And with the X, communism, capitalism, assisted dying. So whatever sort of system or political ideology you have. If you think, okay, that's how it should work, fine. But then you put real sinful human beings in to try and make it work, and you always get a mess at the end of it. So I think whatever we do, ideally should take into account the fact that we've got real human beings running it and being in the system. And that's why you need so many more checks and balances. And that's why I think, on balance, you're better to have a system where you're not legalizing assisted dying.
Yeah. Well, let's turn our language attention to the language of assisted dying. But actually, there are a few different concepts in play here. There's the term euthanasia. There's the phrase physician-assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide. So can we start with the difference between those two concepts, euthanasia and assisted suicide or assisted dying? What are the difference between those things?
Absolutely. So you're basically talking about a medicalized killing. And the difference between euthanasia on the one hand and assisted suicide on the other is who does the final act. So with an assisted suicide, your physician will prescribe the medication to you, pharmacists will supply it, etc., but you're the one who actually does it. That might be that you drink some liquid or take some tablets, or even that someone sets up an intravenous infusion and it's connected up to a computer and you're the one who presses the button to start it going. But you're the one who does the final act. Whereas in euthanasia, everything else may be the same in terms of the medication that's used, but it's someone else who does that for you. It's a nurse who gives the injection, or a doctor who gives the injection, or someone else. So in one sense, there might not be very much difference, but in terms of who makes the final decision, who presses the button or actually does the final thing, it's either you or it's that third party. So you can see there's some quite different ethical differences there. Like in euthanasia, what if you change your mind? Or what if someone does it when they haven't really asked you? If you're sick and in hospital and perhaps you've lost mental capacity, perhaps you've got dementia, perhaps you're in a coma anyway, someone else could decide that actually this is the best thing for you, and they could perform euthanasia on you. Whereas with assisted suicide, whatever else is going on there, you as the patient are saying, this is what I'd like to do, and you're showing that by actually taking the medication. Now, campaigners often don't like the term assisted suicide because they say, well, these patients don't have mental health problems, they're not suicidal in the classic understanding. And that is often true. We're not usually talking about people with severe depression who are suicidal as we'd understand it, but still suicide is just the rational act of taking your own life. It doesn't necessarily mean anything about your mental state. So you might have a mental health problem but still have mental capacity. It might be something else that you do. So I think it's an accurate term to use, because when people start talking about assisted dying, it sounds nicer, but actually it's really confusing. We mentioned about palliative care and hospice care before. Those are people who are dying, and you are assisting them by providing holistic symptom control and care as they die. So you could say that's assisted dying, but that's completely different to what we're talking about here in terms of active killing of patients. And when you talk to different people in surveys and things, they often completely misunderstand it. So some people think that hospice care is assisted dying, some people think that it's euthanasia, some people think that it's other end-of-life decision-making, like deciding that you don't want to have a particular life-saving treatment or that you want to stop a particular life-sustaining treatment, all of which might be ethically quite uncontroversial and quite appropriate. But assisted dying is quite confusing. When you look at it in the UK context, which is what I'm particularly familiar with, Dignity in Dying, I said, is our main campaign organisation, and they say what they're campaigning for is assisted dying, and that just means adults with mental capacity, you've got a terminal illness with only 6 months to go. So they're really clear on their definition, but so many other people are not clear on their definition, and so many other places that talk about an assisted dying law, they have much wider scopes of legislation. So I think it's thoroughly confusing to use that term in general, and I think the more accurate we can be about that, the better. It's in the interests of those who are campaigning to change the law on assisted dying to use that term, because it sounds nice and it blurs the edges, and it makes it harder to talk talk about the details, but I think we absolutely do need to talk about the details of it.
Well, I'm curious, though, how would you respond to their claimed reason for distinguishing between assisted suicide and assisted dying? Because my understanding is that what they say is they are, or at least in some cases, like the rabbi that you debated on Unbelievable, they say that, look, we're not advocating that just anybody can opt for an assisted death, which would be an assisted suicide, but it's specifically people who are already in the process of dying. And so what you're helping them to do, you're not helping them to commit suicide, you're just helping them to die better than they're already dying. How would you respond to that reason for distinguishing between the terms?
Sure, and I think that's a good example of one of those things where as soon as you introduce real people and real situations, it starts to get messy. So what Dignity in Dying is campaigning for, like you said, is terminal illness for adults only with mental capacity with 6 months left to live. That's great. What if you've got a terminal illness and you've got 12 months left to live and you're suffering unbearably? How is that compassionate for someone to say, in 6 months' time, you'll qualify for that, but right now I'm afraid you don't. It's really hard to predict exactly how long someone's got left to live. Doctors get that wrong all the time, and so we tend not to give people a time frame, or we tend to talk in terms of days, weeks, months, or years, but even that is often hard to predict. So putting it down to 6 months is really hard to predict, and then it's very hard to keep it that way. Now, within the UK, there are a couple of famous campaigners called Paul Lamb and Tony Nicklinson, and they have died in recent years. In fact, Paul Lamb just died in the last few months. He was a long-term campaigner for assisted dying or assisted suicide because he was injured in a car crash. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He just had a little bit of movement, I think, in one of his hands. But he was in constant pain and constant suffering, both physically and psychologically, for 30 years. And so, quite understandably, he wanted to have that choice to end his life. Actually, he died naturally, as we understand, earlier this year. But his application was turned down because he wasn't terminally ill. But on what grounds could you say, yes, it's okay when you've only got 6 months or 9 months or 12 months left to live? But if you've got 30 years left to live of pain and suffering, where's the compassion in that?
Right.
It's crazy and it makes no sense. And when I was debating Rabbi Romain there, it was interesting just to push him a little bit in there, because campaigners often say they're the ones that are compassionate, and people like myself are being uncompassionate and uncaring. But they're not supporting somebody like Paul Lamb, who's got years of suffering. And I think most people who answer surveys about, when you see surveys of public opinion for assisted dying, most people don't really understand that you're excluding people who are perhaps suffering for years. So that's why I think timelines are completely arbitrary like that, and they really don't make sense. And Canada is a great example of that. So Canada changed its law. Its law came into effect in 2016. They didn't put quite such a tight definition on end of life, but they said that your death had to be reasonably foreseeable. We'd understand that as being terminal illness. And for the first 3 years or so, that's generally what it was. Now, some people who had maybe 5 years, 10 years left to live, they were starting to creep in, so that reasonably foreseeable category was becoming more elastic. But then in 2019, there was a court case in Quebec, and 2 disabled people who were definitely not terminally ill said, well, this is discriminatory. We're suffering. We want to have an assisted death. Why don't we qualify? And the court in Quebec said, yep, you're absolutely right. And the government had to go and look at it. These 2 people, they did get assisted death, and then now the law has changed in Canada so that terminal illness or the reasonably foreseeable category, it's no longer there. And they're just sort of racing. We talk about the slippery slope. They're just racing down that because, now 2016, it was reasonably foreseeable death. That became more elastic. 3 years later, there's that court case in 2019 Now in 2021, the law has changed across the whole of Canada, and they're even saying that in 2023, you'll be able to qualify for what they call medical aid in dying, purely for mental illness. No physical illness, no physical disability, no terminal illness, purely a mental illness. And that should really frighten us.
Yeah.
So it's a great example of how something that was started off with a really tight definition, it's grown and it's grown and it's grown. People always talk about safeguards. They say, look, we'll change the law, but we'll put all these safeguards in position. Something that is a safeguard on one side of changing the law, as soon as you get to the other side of it, it becomes a barrier to patient access.
Right.
And once you've decided that assisted death, assisted medical killing is a good thing, then it's not about how do we stop access to that. It's about how do we widen access to that, because if it's good for some people, surely it's good for many people. And then ultimately you get down to situations like in Switzerland or now in Germany, where it really just is about choice. If you want to die, you can die. There may be nothing wrong with you. You might just be old and lonely and feel that you've completed your life, so off you go.
Yeah. I was reminded there toward the tail end of what you were saying. There was a point in time in your discussion with that rabbi where Rabbi Remain said, I want to open options up, you want to close them down. And it occurred to me as you were talking just now that that's exactly what somebody could say to him who is campaigning for, not just assisted dying, but assisted suicide outright, or even euthanasia. You, Rabbi Remain, are trying to close options down. I'm trying to open them up. It's astonishing how inconsistent it seems people advocating for this ultimately have to be. And that's another thing. There was one point where you really pressed him on consistency, and when it became clear that he wasn't being consistent, he said something like, well, that's a very clever response, but it's not relevant. And I'm as a debater thinking, actually, that was extremely relevant, and you've just basically dodged it. It was interesting. There's this problem we have, I think, as humans, where when inconsistency in our reasons is revealed, rather than deal with the inconsistency and adjust accordingly, we just, try to bury our head in the sands. And it seems like that's what happened on the show.
Yeah, I think that's very much the case. And because Rabbi Remain, he's the vice chair of Dignity in Dying. The chair of Dignity in Dying is Baroness Meacher in the House of Lords. She's got some proposed legislation, what we call the Meacher Bill, which is going through the House of Lords, through the UK Parliament. It's passed a couple of stages. There was a sort of 7 or 8 hour debate just recently when that was all debated out. And again, in that debate, Baroness Meacher and some of her colleagues, they're saying, look, this is not going to extend. We're just talking about adults, terminal illness, 6 months, mentally competent. And yet we knew very, very much that some of the people debating on her side, pushing for this law change, we know that they're part of organisations in the UK that are already campaigning to go further. So Baroness Bakewell, I think, who was speaking for the Meacher Bill, she's part of Humanists UK. They're one of the other organisations already in the UK that is campaigning for a much broader law. And as soon as we got through that debate, then you saw people breaking ranks a bit and saying, well, this is a good first step. Of course, we would want the law to be wider than that. And I'm saying, that's what we've been saying all along. But this is what, Jonathan Remain, Baroness Meacher, you're telling us, no, it won't widen. And your own friends who are with you on this bill, they're already saying we want it to go further. So I think there's a massive consistency problem. I'm sure that some of the people who just want to keep this law very tight are sincere in that. I think they're frankly deluded. And I think that certainly a good number of them will know exactly what they're doing, that this is just getting a foot in the door. It's a first step. As soon as we get comfortable with that, then we can move things on further. And some campaigners are honest enough to admit that, and some are perhaps naive in that. But yeah, of course it's going to go further. They'll often say to us, Canada is not relevant to us. Canada is so relevant to us because it shows just how fast things can go in a Western liberal democracy like our own.
Right. Yeah. Well, here in a moment, I want to start looking at some of the arguments for and against assisted dying, as its proponents prefer to call it. But first, I just want to talk briefly about how much of the population is for or against this kind of phenomenon. Beginning with the general population, neither medical professionals nor really outwardly religious people. Just in general, what does the general population in the UK, I'm guessing, is where you're most familiar with the statistics, where do they fall? Are they largely in favor, largely opposed, somewhere in between?
They are largely in favor. So when you see surveys that are quoted, they tend to run the 80-something% being in favor. And those that are proposing the legislation, they will say, look, so many people want this. Why are we out of touch? Why are we refusing them? That kind of thing. But when you dig down behind the details, it matters very much who you ask, and it matters what you ask them. So most surveys are to do with just average people, including people like you and me, people who are not facing terminal illness, people who are not actually having to deal with these issues firsthand. They might have had a friend or a relative who've gone through a difficult death, and they might be worried about that. They'll have heard lots of things in the media, because the media is constantly being stoked with bad deaths and difficult dying processes and that sort of thing. There's a lot of fear-mongering going on around that. And when you say to people, well, would you like to be able to have choice and control at the end of your life so that you could die peacefully in a manner of your own choosing at a time of your choosing? Well, most people say, yeah, of course. Who wouldn't want that? And that's why you get such high percentages. But most people don't understand, like we've said, that actually you change this law and then you're going to extend the law much further. Most people don't understand the potential for coercion of people, the corruption of palliative care and of the healthcare in general, and how the law will extend, and how the various other problems like that. Most people don't understand that, and when you do ask people about that, very often when they see the problems, the percentages go down. Mm. Interestingly, these sort of 85-odd% things that have been quoted so long, most of those are pre-COVID. There was another survey done in the UK after COVID, just this last year. The percentages were about 70%. Now, it's still significantly in favour, but actually that's a 10% drop.
Yeah.
I don't hear any of the campaigners talking about that, and you just wonder whether that's actually making people think more about the problems that can happen when we've seen so many problems about, people not being cared for properly, not having the right level of care or resources at the end of life. And then there was another survey done more recently of parliamentarians, so MPs, members of parliament in the UK, and of them 35% were for, 35% were against, and the rest were undecided. So it's evenly split. Now campaigners will say, oh, this just shows that Parliament is out of touch, they need to catch up with the population. But I would say, no, that's exactly the wrong way to look at that. Parliamentarians are the people who are used to making laws, to thinking about, well, if I make this law, that's a seductive argument, but will there be unintended consequences? Will vulnerable people be harmed? Will something else change? Will this law progress further in a way that we don't want to do? That's what they do for a living. And so we should be listening to them and saying, why is it that the people who are experts in lawmaking are actually much less supportive of just your average person on the street who you ask?
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But what about medical professionals? Because it seems like they would be somewhat better versed in some of these topics than the general population and even parliamentarians. So to what extent is are medical professionals in favor of the legalization of assisted dying?
Yeah, great question. So there is general support amongst many medical professionals, but there's also a good level of opposition as well. And again, it still depends on what you ask them and who you ask, etc. So the British Medical Association, which is the main medical organisation in the UK, about half of UK doctors are part of that, not all, but about half. They did a survey a couple of years ago looking at that, and they found that I think it was about 40-something% were in favour of assisted dying, about 30-odd% were against it, and then about 25% were neutral. And campaigners latched onto that and said, great, the British Medical Association should no longer be opposed to assisted dying. And so this year there was a policy debate, and they did decide to go neutral. But when you dig down into that kind of data and you look at it, you think, well, what did the palliative care doctors say? Palliative care doctors who deal with dying patients and have conversations with them all the time, they're overwhelmingly opposed. More than 80% opposed to the legalization, and that should really make us sit up and take notice. The people who were most in favour were medical students who've never had to deal with dying people, often retired doctors who don't have to do it anymore, and then specialties that don't tend to deal with dying people and those kind of conversations. So general practitioners like myself, elderly care doctors and palliative care physicians, they tend to be the ones who are most opposed to that. And again, the closer you get to dealing with death on a regular basis, the more you tend to recoil from assisted dying legislation. So it's very important to look at those data, to dig down into that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Medicine is it's in certain ways similar to fields like law enforcement and emergency services and a host of others, where we, the lay people, have ideas of what happens in the world in those spheres, but those ideas are very often just the result of fiction. So in the case of medicine, one of these things that we as lay people tend to be very familiar with is this idea that medical professionals say an oath as part of their as part of their training. It's called the Hippocratic Oath, and featuring in that oath is the commitment to not do intentional harm. Now, I don't know to what extent that's a real thing, just how seriously it's taken in the medical field. But my question for you is, to the extent that oath is a real thing that actually motivates people, how do medical professionals who are in favor of assisted dying reconcile their commitment, their having made that oath, with their support for the practice of not avoiding doing intentional harm, but actually doing intentional harm by helping them to kill themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Hippocratic Oath goes back to Hippocrates, who was a Greek physician roughly 2,000 years ago, and he and his band and his colleagues, they basically changed the practice of medicine, because before that, the kind of doctor or physician you would go to would be a little bit more like the witch doctors that we know of today. They've got the knowledge, they could cure you or they could kill you. They might give you the thing that cures you or the poison that kills you, and it may be that someone else pays them more than you pay them to kill you rather than to cure you. Whereas Hippocrates and his colleagues, they basically said, no, we will not do harm to people. So they didn't do abortion, they didn't do euthanasia, lots of other things like they didn't have sex with their patients. Revolutionary thought. But the Hippocratic medicine has really been the foundation of modern healthcare in the Western world, and we really should think really carefully about that before losing that. Now, the Hippocratic Oath, as it were, certainly medical schools in the UK don't swear that anymore, largely because it's a little bit antiquated. It talks about Greek gods and that kind of thing. But the ideas have come there. I'm not actually sure whether it's still used in many North American schools. I think it may be more, but there have been evolutions of that. So the World Medical Association has the International Code of Medical Ethics. There was the Geneva Declaration from the United Nations, and many of these were thought out again in the wake of the Second World War. So many of your listeners will know that physicians in Nazi Germany were corrupted by the idea of a life not worthy of living. There's this idea that you can be alive but not worthy of being kept alive. And so there was a massive euthanasia program in Germany before the Second World War, and then that evolved into the gas chambers and the Holocaust. So things can go terribly badly wrong once you start changing the basis of your ethics. And so in the late 1940s, like the UN, the WMA, they basically said we need to come back to these and reiterate these things, that we will not take human life. We will respect life from conception. Now, of course, that's been eroded as abortion has gained more traction. So the Hippocratic Oath talks against abortion, whereas most doctors today are comfortable with that in certain circumstances. But still, these historic codes talk about not killing patients and not taking life in terms of euthanasia. So I think we should think really carefully about that and not erode those things. There are good reasons why we have these oaths. And to change that is actually a really big deal. People will tell you it's not a big deal, but it is. Very often, assisted dying is being put in terms of compassion. These people are suffering, they want to die, you should do that for them. That is good, compassionate care to help them, to assist them to die. And it can sound like that, but actually it's a massive, massive shift in medical ethics. And once we've seen that even if you make some of these changes with good intention, the runaway train starts to gather momentum and you can't turn back the clock. And Canada, again, great example. Things have changed very rapidly in just a few years there. And over a longer period, we've seen that happening in Holland and Belgium and other places as well. So we've got to be really careful about jettisoning 2,000 years of principles of medical ethics.
Yeah, indeed. Well, there's one last question around popularity that I want to ask you, and then we'll start talking about arguments. And you mentioned a moment ago that the closer the medical professional gets to death, the more likely it is that they will oppose the legalization of assisted suicide or assisted dying. Well, what about people of faith? Is it the case that the more central a role in someone's life their faith plays, whether that's the Christian faith or Judaism or Hinduism or whatever, is it the case that the more central to oneself faith is, the more likely they are opposed to assisted dying, or is that not the case?
No, I'd say that's exactly the case. The more seriously you engage with your faith, the less likely you are to support assisted dying. So I mentioned in the UK there's this religious alliance for assisted dying, for dignity in dying. The two leaders of that are Rabbi Remain. He's a liberal rabbi, so most Jewish people would not see him as an authority. He's not Orthodox, he's not conservative, he's not even Reformed Judaism, he's liberal Judaism, so he's the sort of the furthest away from the centre in the four categories of Judaism that you have. And within the Church of England, there's another Canon Rosie Harper, who again is a very liberal kind of vicar. She would often, I think, describe God as she would be very very supportive of sort of queer theology and that sort of thing, to my understanding. So not really orthodox part of the leadership of the church, and certainly not evangelical in terms of persuasions. And that's often how we see things, how things happen. Now, there were two exceptions to that, two famous Christians who are publicly supportive of that, and that's former Archbishop George Carey, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Church of England, and then Desmond Tutu, who was the Archbishop in South Africa. And they're two very famous Christians who've come out in their retirement in support of assisted dying. So many people will use them as examples and say, well, if it's good enough for them, why is it not good enough for you? But I think when you listen to what these these faith proponents are saying in terms of the arguments they're using, they're generally just using the same fairly superficial arguments that other proponents of assisted dying use. It's about choice, it's about autonomy, it's about compassion, it's about dignity. They're tending not to engage seriously with their faith and the arguments that come from a faith perspective. So I think that's really important to understand that. I mean, for instance, George Carey, he will say publicly that his mind was changed by the case of Tony Nicklinson, one of the people I mentioned before. He was incapacitated by a stroke. He was severely disabled, but he was not terminally ill. And so George Carey, publicly says that was the person who changed his mind, and yet he's campaigning for that current law of the 6 months terminally ill. And that, again, is an inconsistency. So he's already campaigning for, or he was convinced of the suffering of someone who was not captured by the current legal proposals. So to me, that just says it all, that you're going to go further if you just focus on compassion and dignity and that sort of thing.
Yeah. All right, well, let's turn our attention then to arguments, beginning with arguments against, specifically from a Christian perspective. If it's the case that most people of faith, people who take their faith very seriously, people who are orthodox within their respective religions, and in particular Christians, if it's the case that they are the most opposed to assisted dying, the question becomes, well, why? What distinctly Christian reasons, or at the very least religious ones, do you think that people of faith should have for being opposed to the legalization of assisted dying?
There's probably three I'd talk about. So first of all, people often hear about the term the sanctity of life. The idea that human life is special and we shouldn't end it. Now, of course, that is true. There are plenty of faith-based arguments to talk about that. In Genesis 9, when God forbade the shedding of human blood, of course, that's we're familiar with that. And other than in terms of war or perhaps capital punishment, you don't kill people. Now, that's stood us in good stead for a long time. But then the arguments of compassion will sometimes come up against that as well. So I think defining sanctity of life can be a little bit difficult. It's a very religious argument, and so you need to think carefully about where you go with that one. I think many religious people will sort of use that as a straight off the bat kind of thinking. But I think we need to be able to express the situation much clearer in secular language. So generally, when we talk about it, most people of faith will understand the argument of protecting the vulnerable. That is something that as Christians and a people of faith we're called to do. And most people who are terminally ill, chronically ill, disabled, perhaps suffering with dementia or something else, they are very vulnerable. And we're very concerned, particularly, that changing the law makes them more vulnerable because they are then open to perhaps coercion, perhaps a feeling that they should take that choice. The right to die can very easily become the duty to die. And if you're an elderly person with a chronic or terminal illness or a chronic disability, your care costs might be eating up the money that you wanted to give to your grandson to go to university, or you wanted to give that to your children for something else. You're aware of the emotional burden of caring on you. Many older people think, oh, everyone else would be better if I wasn't here. And once you've got that choice there, it's not just that someone who really wants to make that choice can make that choice. It's that everybody has that choice put before them.
Yeah.
It's not should you choose to die, it's should you really continue to keep living? And then almost it becomes selfish to continue living, and it changes that round completely. So, that the whole idea of pressure on vulnerable people, it's usually not the sort of out and out compulsion. Someone holding up some lethal pills to you and say, take it, Granny, we don't want you anymore. That's very unlikely to happen. But it's that subtle pressure. The choice is there, the duty to die. Should I be asking for this? And society just changes very much. Now, the arguments for and against abortion are quite different in some ways, or the context is very different. But we've certainly seen that when abortion was legalised in the UK, it was back in the 60s, it was meant to be just for a small number of hard cases. But now it's accepted, and it's much more the idea that, oh, you wouldn't have an abortion? How strange.
Yeah.
And people are even being seen as selfish for, say, bringing a disabled child into the world because, well, it's going to take up lots of, costly healthcare and that sort of thing. And you see how society's views of something changes with time. So protection of the vulnerable is a massive area that I think people of faith take very seriously. But then one of the other things is looking at this idea of autonomy. Autonomy is so much the driving force behind assisted dying legislation. And I think it sounds fine at one level to say, well, surely people should have a choice. And yeah, a limited degree of choice is of course, very important, or a reasonable degree of choice. But once we start making my choice and my rights the thing that is really driving it, then I think Christians should think, hang on, autonomy, self-rule, my rights, I'm in charge. Isn't that the nature of sin? Sin is when we take our own needs, our own wants, and we elevate that above other people. It's when we say I'm in charge rather than God's in charge, or rather than, it's putting myself before the needs of my community and family. We should be really careful about that. And I think that's one reason why, because the autonomy argument is so much to the fore in campaigning for that. And I think people of faith often have an instinctive understanding that unbridled autonomy is not a good idea. It's the essence of sin, like we've talked about, and it causes so many problems. So the sanctity of life, however we describe that, compassion for vulnerable people, protection for vulnerable people, and being suspicious or wary of arguments about autonomy. I think they're three really good arguments, faith-based arguments. And of course, we have to express them in ways that non-religious people can understand. There's no good just quoting Bible verses at people, because they won't accept that. But when you talk about human nature rather than sinfulness, people tend to understand that actually does really make a difference in the world that we live in.
Yeah. There was one other argument I think that you made on Unbelievable that strikes me and that I want to ask you about, and that has to do with the value of, or the possible value, the potential value in suffering. There was a point in your discussion where Rabbi Romain said there's nothing sacred about suffering, and I'm thinking, what? What world do you live in? Because it seems to me that both inside religious traditions and outside of it, there is great value often found in suffering. And it seems to me that, or one fear I have, is that if we legalize assisted dying on the grounds that, people are suffering terribly, then what we're doing is we're saying exactly what Rabbi Romain said. There's nothing sacred about suffering, or at the very least, there's nothing possibly sacred about suffering. And so if we communicate that to the larger society, then people who are suffering, it seems to me, will be less likely to see the value in it that God may very well intend for them to get out of their suffering. You can't help but read the Bible and come across countless cases where biblical authors seem to think that there's purpose in their suffering. And legalizing assisted dying seems to me to risk making people think there can't possibly be purpose in suffering. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that a possible faith-based reason to oppose it as well? Yeah,
I think it's a really important reason. It's one that we have to be very careful about how we make it, because it can very easily sound like, oh, you want me to suffer? That's so cruel. And of course, we've got to be really careful about that. There is, as Christians, we want to relieve suffering. We want to be compassionate. We want to care for people in a dignified manner. And yet, because so much of the driving is about, it's my autonomy, it's my dignity. I can't do what I value in life, therefore my life has no meaning. I think we need to be able to open up that possibility that suffering can have meaning, it can have purpose. We shouldn't just assume that there's nothing in it. And I think that is a very despondent and depressing way to look at life, that if I can't do the things that I used to enjoy, then that's it, I'm off. There's no good in that. And of course, like you say, we see throughout the Bible so many people have suffered and good things have come out of that. We see that from the book of Job, particularly, of course, ultimately the suffering of Jesus on the cross brought about so much good in this world. It's the ultimate good in this world that came from the ultimate suffering. And so many people who've gained any kind of wisdom through life, it's because they've had to go through difficult times in order to learn that and to reflect on that. And you gain wisdom through going through difficult times. So I think in theory, yes, of course, we need to be able to open up that possibility and say there might be a meaning in this, there might be a purpose in that, there might be something you can gain from that, and we need to avoid shutting that down. I think as well, it's because human beings are the only species that can really see that sort of purpose in their suffering. We often hear the argument, well, you wouldn't treat a dog like that, you wouldn't let your pets suffer like that, we'd just, put them out of their misery. And again, that's a superficially appealing argument. If you have a dog that's got cancer, it's in pain, you don't want to let it suffer. And so people say, well, you wouldn't treat your dog like that. And I would say, yeah, that's because people are not pets. You're not talking about the same things. We don't treat people in the same way as animals. We don't buy them in shops. We don't keep them in cages. I think you used the example when we were discussing this show about if you're driving down the road, you hit a deer and it's in pain, what do you do? And it may be appropriate to put that deer out of its misery and to end its suffering by killing it, as cleanly as you can. But, with a human, it's entirely different. If a human is suffering at the end of life, there's a narrative, that there's a whole meaning of life that they have to put into perspective. If a human being has a terminal diagnosis, that opens up so many questions. Are there things that I still want to accomplish in my life? Are there relationships that I want to put right? Are there things that I need to achieve or to hang on for? Maybe the birth of a grandchild or that sort of thing. Is there a conversation I need to have? Very often at the end of life, people are thinking, I just want to get to here, then I just want to get to here. It may be that you want to see an event like the marriage of a son or daughter, birth of a grandchild, or a long lost relative who's traveling to come and see you so you can have that conversation, put something right with them. So many good things can happen towards the end of life, and anyone that's been involved in caring for dying people or who've had that in their family will very often see the incredible benefits that can be had during those difficult periods at the end of life. When my own father-in-law died of cancer about 15 years ago, it was a sad time, it was a difficult time, but he did so many great things for us as a family. He left so many great memories with us. We had so many good conversations, lots of great communication. There was restoration of different things, and I wouldn't have changed that. If he'd just been hit by a bus, or if he'd gone and had an assisted death as soon as he knew that his cancer was terminal, we'd have missed so many of those things. And so whilst you don't want to put that across negatively and say, it is God's will for you to suffer, he's not some kind of divine torturer, we need somehow to be able to take the focus off ourselves. Once we say that, I must be in charge of everything, again, that's making our autonomy our God. That is the essence of sinfulness. We need to be able to let go. So much of having a peaceful death is about learning to let go, learning to let others care for you in a way that you maybe didn't do before. Many of the people who are driving assisted suicide legislation, they are the people they've been company directors, they've been high-flying people in business, they've been lawyers, they've been doctors, they've been used to calling the shots and being in charge, and now they can't do that. It's very hard for them to accept that. Many people who've never had that level of autonomy don't see it as a problem so much when it's taken away from them.
Yeah. Well, one thing that might complicate the discussion or the decision-making process for us Christians is that arguably the Bible doesn't speak very clearly to this specific topic. I said arguably, but don't react too quickly. For example, there are a number of what seem to be outright suicides in Scripture. I'm looking at Ahithophel in 2 Samuel 17, Judas in Matthew 27, and the Philippian jailers near suicide in Acts 16. But then there are what arguably could be called assisted deaths. So Abimelech in Judges 9 is mortally wounded and requests help dying in a more dignified manner. Saul in 1 Samuel 31 is seriously injured and expects that he's going to be killed brutally by his would-be captors, and so he requests help to die with more dignity. And then in 1 Kings 16, Zimri is king for just 7 days when his city is captured, and he kills himself before presumably the attacking force can kill him in a worse fashion. Now, none of these, neither the outright suicides nor the assisted deaths, are explicitly condemned by Scripture. And so, do you think that an argument could be made that we should conclude that the Bible's just neutral on the topic?
Great question, and people do raise that. I mean, no, I don't think that's what we should conclude, because when you see those suicides in the context of the narrative of Scripture, they are the sort of end process of bad decisions from other people. So Ahithophel, it's basically God's judgment on him. And Judas, of course, it's God's judgment on him. You know, he's the one that takes the final act, but it's not put across as a positive thing. This is someone for whom, you know, they've committed a terrible act. They can't cope with it, and therefore they take their own life. It's the final sort of shame of their life in doing that. And even with Saul, you know, his death in battle was a judgment on him for walking away from God's purposes. And you know, the question of, like, you know, would it have been right to put him out of his misery? You know, you can make an argument for that one, but actually that's just a detail in it. You know, his death in shame and shame and destruction and judgment, that was all sort of part of God's judgment on him. So there's never any way that it's looked upon positively. You know, it's not like the sort of, you know, Greek philosophers, you know, the noble death, you know, this sort of thing is like the culmination of a wise life. It's like, no, this is a real problem here. It's always looked on negatively.
I agree with you. Zimri, whom I mentioned, is another example where the text explicitly says that his death 7 days into his rule is because of the sins he committed by which he achieved the throne in the first place. The one standout in my mind, though, that does make me wonder a little bit, if I'm just being completely honest, is Samson. Because Samson, he as he's, you know, again, this, you're absolutely right. This is the end of a story that is filled with shame, in that it follows after he's finally submitted to his own lust by letting his love interest cut his hair, and then that's what results in him being captured, and et cetera, et cetera. So there is that shame element there, but in this end to his story, at least on the surface of it, it seems kind of like exactly that good death, that euthanatos that somebody wants to look for, where he says, God, let me die too, and in the process destroys the people that had held him captive. So I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on why even Samson's own assisted death or suicide, to the extent that you could call it that, why it's not even it is seen positively in Scripture?
Yeah, it's a great question again, and I think I would see, you know, Samson was a warrior. That was like his final act as a warrior. You know, he brought down the temple not to take it, not with the intention of taking his own life. He knew that was going to happen, but it was to destroy the Philistine temple and to kill the enemies around him. You know, it was his ultimate act as a warrior. His death was, in a sense, a side effect. So just like, you know, if a soldier goes into a, you know, what you might call a suicide mission, they're not doing it to commit suicide. They're doing it to achieve a military objective. They
Right.
just know that their life may end through that, and you know, that's a risk that they take.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. The very nature of a suicide mission is that it's really not a suicide. It's a willingness to give one's life up in order to accomplish an end. Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Well, so we've talked about some faith-based reasons for opposing opposing the legalization of assisted dying. In the time that we've got left, I want to respond to a few arguments for its legalization. And you've already addressed one of them I was going to ask you about, which is the concept of humaneness, where, we put an animal out of its misery if it's suffering. And so we don't need to rehash that one. But there are at least three other distinct, granular arguments that I was able to find people making in favor of assisted dying. And the first one of those I want to ask you about, and you've touched on it already, but I want to see if there's any more you'd like to say on it, is the issue of autonomy. So abortion supporters often say that a woman should be free to do what she wants to do with her body. And we pro-lifers very often respond, rightly, by pointing out that, yeah, but your abortion doesn't chiefly impact your body. It impacts somebody else's body, namely the body of the child that you're murdering in its mother's womb. But euthanasia is a bit different, and assisted death, is a bit different in the sense that it only ends the lives, arguably, of the ones who wish to end their lives. So shouldn't they have the choice to do to themselves what affects only themselves? Or would you say that maybe it doesn't, in fact, only affect themselves?
Yeah, I think it is a stronger argument because it's, you're basically saying this is just about me and I'm making that decision. But as we've said before, it's not just about one person ending their life. Certainly in the UK and in most countries, suicide is legal. You're not going to be, if you try to commit suicide and you fail, you're not going to be then prosecuted for it. It's the whole idea if you're wanting to change the law so that your rights impose duties on other people, duties on the medical system to provide that for you. And once you change that law, then every end-of-life conversation changes because it's not just a right for you, it's a right that everyone has, and it's a duty that I as a doctor would have to have. So every doctor in every hospice across the country suddenly has to say, well, here are the options. We can do this, we can try that, we can try that. But of course, you do have the option of an assisted death if that all seems like too much. And, I can, talk to my colleague, or we can talk about it ourselves, about maybe you'd like to end it all, quicker. So it's a very different kind of thing. And it's about how you change the conversation that then impacts everybody. So, I might decide that I want to, drive much above the speed limit in my car because I have to get to the airport.
You gave
today.
This example in the show. I was just about to ask you about it.
Yeah, and you'd understand that. If you want to get to a plane, or if your wife is in labour, you've got to get to the hospital. There might be occasions when you say, "Yeah, I see why you did that," but then to change the law to say people can drive as fast as they want if there's a good reason for it. If you're late for work or late for the airport, or you've got to get to the hospital, you can drive as fast as you want. You're just going to have chaos because then everyone starts saying, well, I'm a good case, I should be able to do that. And you've completely changed the situation, the society in which you live, and then everyone's doing it, and then you're impacting on vulnerable people. Road accidents will go up, and more vulnerable people will be impacted by that. So it's not just about the individual who wants to make a choice. It's about changing the entire conversation in society and in healthcare about what choices are available to you and what duties that imposes on health carers.
Yeah. If viewers have any difficulty understanding how legislating the right to get assisted death might impact others, just think about insurance companies, right? Medical insurance companies, if the more that assisted dying is legalized, it's doubtless that insurance companies, and maybe you could tell me this is already happening, I don't know, but insurance companies would cover the cost. There'd be pressure upon them to cover the cost of the drugs and the technology required to assist in somebody's death. But here's the thing. If insurance companies are pressured and succumb to the pressure to cover those kinds of things, it's doubtless that that's a lot cheaper than the untold thousands, hundreds and thousands, and even millions of dollars that would go into certain extreme forms of palliative care and hospice care. And so just think about what the people behind those insurance companies are going to want to do. They're going to want to encourage the terminally ill and the interminably suffering to opt for that cheaper option on the way out rather than the more expensive kind. So there you've got the insurance putting pressure on people as well, and that's going to be an incredible... Do you know if this has yet entered the realm of insurance companies and how that plays out, or is that yet to be seen?
Oh, no, definitely. That's happened in a number of jurisdictions. So I think, particularly in the US and Canada, where there's a lot of decisions about will your insurance company pay for this. So Roger Foley was, I think, a Canadian man, Foley, and he recorded healthcare as basically saying to them, look, we can't afford to give you the care that you're asking for, but we can afford to offer you medical aid in dying. And that's certainly been there in the news. So yeah, it's an obvious next step because assisted dying is much cheaper. Yeah. And many people will say, well, I don't want that, I want assisted living. But if it comes down to will your insurance company pay for it, many people will be taking decisions based on what options are available to them, not what they actually want.
Yeah, that's really tragic. Well, moving then from the issue of autonomy, let's talk about the argument from Dignity, the organization Death with Dignity, and here I'm getting it from what I'm guessing is the U.S. version. It's not Death in Dignity, like I think you said Rabbi Romain is involved with. It's Death with Dignity.
That's right, yeah, Dignity in Dying in the UK.
That's right. Well, the Death with Dignity website puts it this way: we respect and honor the dignity and worth of all human beings. And right there I have to stifle my vomit at how obviously false that is. But it goes on, we strive to provide all Americans an option that will allow them to die on their own terms, how they choose to define a dignified death. So Mark, how can we as Christians respond to this argument that people who are terminally ill or interminably suffering and want to die what they consider to be a more dignified death should be allowed to do so? Wouldn't it be more dignified to go fairly painlessly and quickly rather than suffer and have to be cleaned by other people and all these things for months or even years?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great argument, and I think it's something that's made very much. But dignity is about a person's worth, and there's three aspects to that. One is what is their actual worth. Of course, as Christians, we'd say, how does God value them? There's how do they value themselves, and there's how do other people value them. And I think we can, by caring for people, restore dignity to them, particularly when they may not be feeling that sense of dignity, if they're needing caring for in different ways, personal care, toileting, that kind of thing. That can be very undignified, but if you do it in a way which confers dignity on people, it can be a much less negative experience. And I think so much of the discussions around dignity is really about autonomy. When people talk about dignity, they really say about, do I feel dignified? And that's about, do I feel that I'm able to live out my life in a way that I'm comfortable with? It's much more actually about autonomy, whereas it's not about their inherent worth or even the worth and the value that other people are conferring on them through the care that they're giving. It's about, can I do the things I used to do? Do I feel dignity or dignified or valued or that sort of thing? So yeah, it's really important. We need to be caring in a dignified way for people. We need to be making sure that healthcare and social care is really doing that. And yet the way that it's being played out in the arguments for assisted dying, very much it's a slippery use of the term, and it's not talking about what that word actually means. It's much more about autonomy very, very often in the contemporary debate. Yeah.
Well, and it occurs to me, well, it doesn't occur to me, this is something that I thought of while I was watching your interaction with Rabbi Romain, that there's actually, it's worth questioning whether assisted deaths are in fact all that dignified, because, and I'm curious to know if you've pursued this at all since your discussion with Rabbi Romain. It came up in the conversation because Justin asked a question from a listener who said that the drugs that are sometimes used to induce assisted deaths are the same kinds of drugs that are used to execute capital criminals, lethal injection. And there is is some question as to whether that means of dying is in fact as painless and as dignified as it's alleged to be. Can you speak to that at all, and whether in fact there is a greater concern there than we may be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is significant concern. So people are told that you'll get a gentle, peaceful, quick, easy death. Sometimes that may be the case, or sometimes that appears to be the case. But often we know that when people take the oral drugs, they may take longer to die than they realize. Sometimes they may vomit, they may have a seizure. There's records of people taking days to die sometimes, or often, more than an hour or two. And that is not the kind of dignified, peaceful death that people are assuming they will get. Now, that might, if you're comparing that with, a few months of difficult decline through cancer or motor neuron disease, you may say, well, okay, that's small change compared to what I'm avoiding. But it's often not as simple as people think. I think that's one reason why in Canada, for instance, they've gone down the euthanasia route, because that way you've got professional anaesthetists who are basically giving you a clean general anaesthetic just without the ventilator, so that then your breathing stops and your heart stops. The whole question about and that's where the sort of assisted suicide naturally goes, because there will be times when people don't die as quickly or as cleanly or as predictably as they think they're going to, and so there'll be more pressure to have the euthanasia there. So in Canada, you can have assisted suicide where you take the drugs yourself, or you can have euthanasia where the doctor does it, cleanly and quickly and reliably, and virtually everybody goes for the euthanasia option there.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, when the two are presented to you and you trust the healthcare system that you work in, most people will go for the quick and clean option. I think the question about executed prisoners is really interesting. This was a study from autopsies that showed that a lot of people who've been executed by lethal injection, they have what you call pulmonary edema. There's fluid waterlogging the lungs. It's almost as if they were perhaps seeming to die by drowning in their own secretions. And, we're not entirely sure what's going on there. It may be that people were actually suffering in those last minutes and seconds, but they couldn't actually voice that. They couldn't move. They couldn't show that. And I think that is a real serious concern. There certainly needs to be much more research done, and it's the people who are proposing the legislation that need to be doing that research. Very often there's a sort of different cocktails of drugs that can be used. They might have unpredictable effects, and I think it's more to say that I'd say there's a grey area there. We just don't know quite what effect some of these drugs are having on the people that are taking them. And in Oregon, for instance, very often there isn't a health carer present, so we have no idea what many of the people are going through as they take the drugs, because it's not actually recorded. So it's more of a question mark. There are some situations where it doesn't go as well as people are led to believe. It's not that it's always happening like that, but sometimes it is, and I think we need to be really cautious about this idea of a sort of quick, gentle death that we're given the idea will always happen, because often it won't happen like that.
Yeah, very well said. Well, there's one last argument I wanted to ask you about that I haven't, to my memory, heard made, but it seems like the kind of argument that could be made in support of the legalization of assisted dying, and it has to do with the finitude of resources. Our hospitals only have so much trained medical staff, only so much life-preserving equipment and technology, only so many hospital beds. So I could see somebody making the argument, although I could understand why they wouldn't want to because of how callous it sounds, but wouldn't it make sense to focus those finite, limited resources on those who want to go on living rather than waste them, quote unquote, on those who rather would die?
Yeah, it is a very relevant thing. I mean, when Canada changed the law recently, they did some calculations about just how many dollars would be saved by extending the law, because then you're obviously not having to put money into that sort of medical care. It's a large amount of money that was saved there. Within the UK, some health economists are making those calculations as well. And I think that there's no doubt that will come into play. People who are commissioning health services will start to think about, well, how much money are we going to put into different things, and if end-of-life assisted dying is cheaper. It's going to be attractive to health economists and commissioners. We mentioned about insurance companies earlier. I think probably what we need to think about there is that my thoughts just gone. You're going to have to.
Well, just how do we respond to the argument that we should focus our limited resources on those who want to go on living rather than on those who would rather die?
Yeah, thank you. I think it is a great question, and I think we need to think very seriously about where we put our investment in healthcare. So much healthcare investment goes into some of the final months of life, and if you think about some of the really expensive cancer treatments that are used, very often they're maybe prolonging someone's life by a few weeks, a few months. There can be a lot of money going into those times at the end of life, and I think it might well be a good idea to think about, should we be perhaps a little more balanced about how we pour resources into some areas of end-of-life care. Sometimes we need to say, look, I think opting for palliative care is probably the sensible thing at this stage. That's a difficult decision to make, but I think that's something that we can ultimately do. Of course, if you change the law, then people who do want to end their life quickly, they can do that. They've got that option. But I think it's really important, like we've said before, that you don't have a law change thinking about how you will save money, because as soon as you do, then you're going to start putting pressure, whether it's real pressure or imagined pressure, or whether it's overt or covert, on these people who've got to make these decisions, and vulnerable people will feel that pressure. So healthcare resourcing is really important. It's very relevant to this, but I don't think it helps the case for assisted dying. I think it should actually turn us away from it, because again, that X plus sin algorithm that I talked about before, as soon as you start to think about saving money through using cheap assisted dying, that's a really difficult road to go down, and most of us don't want to go there.
Yeah.
With good reason.
For sure. And it seems to me that the argument can go the other way around, too. I could just say, well, why do I want to take resources away from what could go toward really life-dignifying palliative care and hospice care and redirect it toward assisted dying? I mean, however we pool our money, it's going to be taking from one place and putting it in another. Excuse me. So I don't think that I don't see that argument really gaining any traction. Are there any other arguments that you have that are often made in favor of legalizing assisted dying that I have failed to cover and that maybe we should address, or do you think I captured them?
I think we've given it a good going over today, haven't we?
Okay, good. Well, what I like to do at the end of my interviews typically is I like to give my guests an opportunity to leave viewers with a parting message. We've been recording now for nearly an hour and a half, and a lot of the things that we've been saying will be long forgotten by our viewers unless they come and watch it a second time. So if there's one thing that you could have them remember and be thinking about after they turn this recording off, even if they forget everything else that we've talked about, what would that be? What would your parting message for them be?
I think my parting message would be that most of what we hear about the legalization of assisted dying, usually it's about despair, it's about giving up, and it's about saying, life is not worth living. And I'd want to say, use that example of Cicely Saunders, the woman who started palliative care and the hospice movement. She did not give up. She looked for a better way, and I think a better way is something that we can all strive for. That's something I want to provide as a healthcare, it's something that I want healthcare systems to provide for. We should be caring for the vulnerable there, making the way that we care for them better, the systems that we care for them better. And I think as soon as we start to say, look, there's no meaning in this, we can't help you, assisted dying is the way. It becomes a very negative counsel of despair. So I'd say, the way of Jesus is to go the extra mile. That is what Cicely Saunders did. That's how we got the hospice movement and palliative care. And I think there's so much more that can be done in that area. We need to be calling for better funding, better acceptance within society, and a better way to look at dying, so that it's not just me and my wants and my needs, and then going for ending things quickly because I've given up.
Yeah, very well said. Well, I very much appreciated your time. If viewers, after this is over, want to check out the Christian Medical Fellowship or any other areas where you're found online, where can they go online to find those resources?
Yeah, sure. I'll give you 4 websites. So cmf.org.uk is the Christian Medical Fellowship. We have some resources on end-of-life ethics, which people are welcome to look at. But I would suggest also dyingwell.org.uk. That's a parliamentary group on dying well. So much of the arguments are there in terms of combating the current push for legalising assisted dying in the UK. And then we're part of a coalition called Care Not Killing in the UK. So it's just carenotKilling.org.uk, and they have a healthcare branch called ourdutyofcare.org.uk. So I'd say look at any of those: cmf.org.uk, dyingwell.org.uk, carenotKilling.org.uk, and ourdutyofcare.org.uk. And then you'll find lots of great stuff on there.
Awesome. Mark, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and hopefully this is something that will help my viewers to think through this topic more carefully, as I'm sure it will, as the issue becomes more and more of a hot topic, and our culture discusses it further and further. So thank you for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Chris. It's been a pleasure.
Well, so there you have it. I hope that you enjoyed the interview. Enjoy is a bit of a fuzzy word here, given the content, given the topic that we discussed in that interview. But I think it's powerful stuff, and I really think that Mark makes a great case for why we as Christians should oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide, even if people want to call it assisted dying. Yeah, something to be thinking about. This topic is going to continue to be a hot button issue for a while. I just recently saw an article that in Switzerland, I think they are trying out or commending for the government's consideration suicide pods, where they're like 3D printed and you can go out into the woods and look up in the sky while you're put to death or whatever. It's crazy. This is going to be a hot button issue. It's going to be something that we as the church have got to confront. It's going to continue to, we're going to have to confront it more and more, I guess is what I'm saying. And hopefully the kinds of tools that Mark is giving us and that the Christian Medical Fellowship are giving us will be useful for us as we undertake that confrontation. All right, so thank you for tuning in. Again, whether you've tuned in live or whether you are watching the recording, I'll be back again in 2 weeks on Monday, January 24th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. I don't know yet what topic I want to do. I am considering doing a short episode on the meaning of Jesus' words when he says in the book of John that the Father has given it to the Son to have life in himself. I think that's very often misunderstood. But I'm also not sure that really merits a whole episode. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do. If you have a particular topic you'd like me to cover on the next episode of Theopologetics, then shoot me an email. The email address is right there on my screen, right here, theapologetics@hotmail.com. And maybe I can whip something together. But either way, we'll do something. I'll be on the air. So again, come back in 2 weeks' time, Monday, January 24th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. God bless and bye-bye. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then,